Well, you made the right choice tuning in to the Zelos podcast. I'm your host, Rocky Snyder. This week, Nathan Norris is in the house with me. He's the lead strength and conditioning coach for the University of Manchester. That's right, in the UK. But before we get started, the NSCA National Conference is happening this summer, July 16th to the 19th in Kansas City, Missouri. I'll be there, and I hope that you come up and say hi to me. And if you can't make it there, how about the Perform Better 3-day functional summit? Chicago is kicking it off in June. Maybe you'll see me there too. July, well, you got Long Beach, California, and then Providence, Rhode Island in August. PerformBetter.com. Check out SatantaCollege.com. And if you want a little break on tuition for maybe your master's degree, just enter the code RS10 for 10% off. Check out my website, RockySnyder.com. We've got continuing education courses and a whole bunch of information, blogs, podcast archives, and a whole bunch more. Just go to RockySnyder.com and drop me a note. Also, check us out on Instagram at Rocky_Snyder. Click the subscribe button and enjoy the show. Well, Nathan, it's not very often I get guests like yourself, I guess you'd say, on the other side of the pond. I've had a few from the UK, and I always enjoy meeting with strength conditioning specialists from other nations because I love to compare and contrast. So before we get underway, just welcome to the Zealous podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I would love, if you wouldn't mind, spend a few minutes, tell the listening audience a little bit about Nathan Norris and how you are now the strength conditioning coach at the University of Manchester and how your career path wound you to be exactly where you are today.
Yeah, sure, of course, I'd love to. Thank you. Like often, a lot of strength and conditioning practitioners, I played a lot of sports. My sport was basketball. So I played basketball in the UK at a fairly high level. Kind of played internationally as well in that sport. But this was back in the late 90s, early 2000s when strength and conditioning wasn't as established as it is now, although it's still quite a junior kind of like career compared to other sectors. Because of my interest in sport and in basketball, I quickly learned that I wasn't the best player on the court through athletic ability, but if I trained really well, and if I trained really hard in the gym or kind of like with the drills on the court, I seemed to be able to keep up with those who possessed far superior athletic ability to myself. So that kind of penny dropped when I was in my late teens or so. I kind of worked that out. The school I went to had two Commonwealth medalist weightlifters as PE teachers. So they would teach Olympic lifting a lot, which transferred into then the basketball team going and learning how to do derivatives of the Olympic lifts, which I fell in love with and suddenly found that was a bit more powerful, a bit stronger, those types of kind of correlations, although I never really realized it at the time. Kind of like I did a degree in sports science, realized that I'd reached my kind of level, plateaued out within the basketball, so kind of began to pursue academia. And then I went in a completely different direction because my wife and I got married not long after university where we met. So for about 10 years, I worked as a youth worker with teenagers with cancer. So supporting them in this kind of psychosocial support, so non-medical, but looking after kind of their psychosocial needs when they were on the units that they got treatment at, or taking them out for trips and events and things like that. And it was around the age of 30 that I kind of started to question, is this what I want to do long term or not? I'd always been involved in sport and I'd spent about 7-8 years away from sports, and decided to kind of let's see if I could dip my toe back in again, basically. I did an internship with a rugby league team. So we have rugby union and rugby league. So in where I was based at that time, Yorkshire, Sheffield, rugby league's the biggest sport compared to union. So there was an internship where I learnt off the head of performance, a guy called Nick Ward, who's now at Altis over in Lake Tahoe. So I learnt off him for a couple of years before then going into the private sector and working in a gym where we trained youth athletes, weekend warriors, kind of like general population. And really, that's probably where I learnt my trade of how to coach, regardless of age, athletic ability, how to coach, how to get the best out of someone. They're paying customers. So whereas in the rugby league team, they were professional athletes, they had to be there. These were people who were paying you for a service. So that changed my focus and shifted my focus in how because suddenly I was delivering day in day out a service that if they weren't happy with, they could potentially walk, which would cost the business money, those types of things. And also you wanting them to get the best out of their reason for being there, their quality of life, or their improving their athletic performance. So it's worked alongside and under a coach, very skilled coach called Larry Hamilton there. And while I was there, I got my accreditation through UKSA, which is the governing body for strength and conditioning in this country, in the UK. And then kind of as we were, my wife and I were figuring out, so we were up in an area called Newcastle at that point, what life looked like next. The opportunity came up to run a strength and conditioning program within an education setting. So kind of between the ages of 16 to 18 years old, which are the top age range of our high school, kind of like sixth form students in this country before they go to university. So I ran that program and got the pleasure of leading teams and kind of developing a program that wasn't there before I started. So I built something and created something that wasn't there. And then about 3 years ago, the opportunity came up to kind of interview for the lead strength and conditioning role at the University of Manchester, where I am now. And so I've been running that program for the last 3 years. So we work with so I have 2 or 3 members of staff, a couple of consultancy S&C coaches, and then one who's assistant S&C. We deliver to our performance teams at the university, our scholars, so they would be our athletes who compete internationally in their sport, whether in age group or at senior level. And then we also support kind of governing bodies in the area who send us their athletes to train, who are on their pathway, but maybe aren't at podium level yet, but are kind of like have been identified as talented athletes and are progressing through that pathway through an organisation called TAS. So I oversee that S&C delivery, and then me and some of the coaches deliver that. And then we have some external contracts as well that we work with in the region. Would be that basketball, rugby, and netball are the ones that we kind of currently deliver to. So we have a range of things going on at the university.
You've got quite a few things going on from the sounds of it. That's amazing. How do you balance that all out?
Yeah, it's a good question. So when I was working at the college, which was the place before the university, a big emphasis for them was on influencing the community and basically supporting these sporting clubs that were in the area. So as I developed the internal program to support the student athlete in that college, I kind of like almost in a nebulous way began to work on a way to support teams and clubs that were interested in strength and conditioning support, be that in season or off season, or all year long, with some of the teams in that region. So I kind of transferred that really into the university, where we have periods of time that are for our performance teams. They typically tend to be in the evenings because they're studying during the day. Our scholars and TAS athletes, as we call them, these NGB, National Governing Body athletes, they tend to come in during the day because they have a bit more flexibility. And then the external contracts are either delivered on the weekends or again in the evenings, and that's kind of shared out between me and my team. So we tend to take ownership over different areas, and kind of like with the teams that I lead, I try and give a lot of autonomy. So if I have a coach who's running the netball program, for example, although we'll touch base and have regular contact, it's theirs to run and shape in the way that works best for them within their framework and timeline, and that meets the needs of that club.
Nathan, that's phenomenal. Okay, so I'm going to back up a little bit because you mentioned you worked with the development teams, teenagers in rugby, and yet your background was primarily in basketball. So you were able to create a strength conditioning program for a sport that you did not pursue as much as other pursuits. So
Yeah.
how did you create that? What was your step-by-step process, if you don't mind?
No, sure, yeah. So with any sport really, and this applies to be that currently rugby union with the England under-18s girls Northwest program that we deliver, or when I've worked in rugby league in the past, and any other sport I've worked in, it tends to be looking at a needs analysis of that sport, so understanding the demands of that sport. But alongside doing that, understanding the needs of that sport, understanding the training age of the athletes coming in at that kind of development phase. Um, so if we take in this country women's rugby or girls rugby under 18s, the level of investment isn't quite as high as the men's. So where we might be able to, if we brought in the men's under 18 squad, we might be able to really push load and really begin to chase the adaptation kind of that we might want of a strength stimulus or whatever that might be. We can still chase those things with the girls, for example, would be that strength and power, but we might be looking more at improving foundational movement patterns if their training age is significantly lower. So when kind of designing those programs, it's taking into consideration, yeah, obviously the needs analysis of the sport, but also the likely training age of the players coming through, what they will have potentially been exposed to at the younger age range. And then from there, what that's going to basically what that kind of initial programming is going to look like. So can they lunge well? Can they squat well? Can they hinge well? Can they brace? Can they land well? Can they jump well? Can they land off two legs? Can they land on one leg? Can they jump off one? Can they jump off two? You know, those kind of like patterns, kind of
Yes.
like just establishing the basic foundational movement patterns. And once we've established competency in those things, we can then start to add load, begin to chase those strength adaptations. But we really want to chase a kind of optimal movement efficiency for that for those players. And obviously each player is different, how they move is different anatomically, as we know. So it's for me, it's a bit of an education piece of helping them to understand what optimal movement looks like for them, and what the kind of key coaching cues are for them, so that as we begin to add, for example, load to the bar or anything else, that they're aware of how they should be moving and what that should look like, that they've been taught how to bail safely out of a squat, or that they're kind of like aware of how to appropriately warm up before they go into a strength session, or what you know, an appropriate plyometric session or a period of plyometrics within an S&C session should look like. So in that age range, I think it ends up forming an education piece, really.
Yeah, because I was wondering how many of those athletes actually have movement proficiency, motor control, the skills in within the weight room, shall we say, the experience of strength conditioning. I don't imagine, but I don't have anything to back it up. But I don't imagine it's going to be a high level. Like you say, it's an educational process. Were you expecting a different potential, a different population in that regard?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Certainly with the girls under 18s, I wasn't sure what to expect, if I'm honest. When I first started, so each year we have a selection process that takes place through the summer. And as part of that process, I would deliver some just movement, kind of like body weight control movement patterns. So being in bridge, or being in a crab position or a bear walk position, or kind of moving in certain positions, and whether the pelvis and the spine can stabilize and stay in control or not. And that taught me a lot, just watching how the girls behaved. It showed me instantly the potential training ages and the variation in those training ages. So some will be at colleges, they're called colleges in these countries, but it's that ages 16 to 18. So it's obviously a bit different from college in America. But some will be at colleges where they have great exposure. So they're really aware of their bodies and have good pelvic control, good kind of like core stability, trunk control. And others won't be aware at all. And it's more they've got to where they are because of their talent rather than their physical kind of like awareness or robustness. So that taught me a lot. Alongside that, one of the things we learned quite quickly is that in the women's game at the younger age range, the level of aerobic capacity is very, very poor, because they've not had the same level of investment and exposure to game and play that the men's and lads will have had going through the years, where they may be playing from the ages of 8 or 9, potentially, depending, you know, through age group or higher. Obviously, the level of contact changes as they go up through the ages. But that exposure, it's not that girls can't play at those younger ages at all. It just they might not have been exposed in the same way. So the things we really kind of like as a team, as a wider team that I'm a part part of that were identified was around this need to develop aerobic capacity, and for that to be an emphasis, because obviously if they don't have the engine, then they're not able to, it doesn't matter how strong they are, if they can't last the full duration of a game, kind of like it becomes a bit pointless. And then build that movement efficiency. They have camp with us twice a month. So the rest of the time is for them to go away and then work on the things that we've identified and kind of be. And what we're seeing over the course of the year is almost like the penny drop. So you get some in at the beginning, and the gaps are quite wide between those who have maybe a training age of 1 or 2 years and those who have a training age of 2 or 3 months. Whereas it's now kind of like the loads might still be different, but at least the movement efficiency of what I'm seeing is much kind of more consistent throughout the whole squad. Yeah.
And did that surprise you?
Yeah, no, that did surprise me. I mean, I expected it to a point because I was familiar with seeing that within that age range when I worked in my previous role, and we still see that at the university with some of our scholars. Some will come in and they're completely brand new, to strength and conditioning. It's their first exposure to it, so you're literally teaching them the very basics of of how to squat, how to lunge, how to hinge, how to push, how to pull, kind of like derivatives of the Olympic lifts, so that you can start to build those things up and introduce what kind of triple extension looks like if we're going after the Olympic lifts with them. So I was expecting it, but I wasn't expecting there to be such a wide range within that of capabilities, if that makes sense.
Well, it makes complete sense. In fact, I think we're going to find that the athletic population is, I won't say is shrinking, but those that have athletic acuity may very well be narrowing just because of technology advancing and taking away the purposeful play or just the need to play.
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, I
So
completely agree.
weightlifting. I myself really enjoyed learning the clean and jerk and snatch, and not standing very far over 5 feet tall here. It is one of those things that I could keep up with my teammates, so to speak, that were larger than me. It was kind of not leveling the playing field, but it sure
Yeah,
did
yeah,
feel
sure.
like, okay, I may not be able to dunk a basketball, but I've got a good outside shot. Okay, I may not be able to do 200 kilos of a clean, but what I can do is quite nice. So I really got into it too. What was it for you that really gave you the passion toward leaning toward weightlifting?
Yeah, I think so personally, as I mentioned before, I grew up in a high school where we had a weightlifting club with coach PE teachers, as they're called over here, who were had competed internationally, so within the Commonwealth Games, which is like one down from the Olympics, and medalled. So we had lots of British age group champions in our school, and our school is, so I'm from a town in North Wales of like 15,000 people, so it's tiny, like in the middle of nowhere, next to a port. You get the ferry over to Ireland, so kind of like as far west as you can go in North Wales, and yet we were producing age group kind of British champions and British record holders. So I kind of, my exposure to it was then, even in kind of around the ages of 12, watching 18-year-old lads throw what appeared to be at the time crazy weights around, and with incredible efficiency. And I think for me it was it began a bit of a love affair with both movement patterns, but with both the snatch and the clean and jerk, although I tend to prefer one over the other. Just personal preference, as in what anatomically works better for me. Yeah, and then I think as I got into as I began my strength and conditioning career, obviously developing power production, the Olympic lifts can play a really important part within that. And there's a lot of kind of research that backs that up within kind of like getting into triple extension with load, and the way that can transfer into kind of like sprintability and kind of explosive power and jump ability. I think the thing that changed for me as I got into it was like kind of and applied that within the strength and conditioning setting, was realizing that although I had spent many years around people who had learned to lift from a young age, so had the ability to get into front rack position or to sit in the bottom of a deep overhead squat or a deep front squat, that isn't necessarily potentially something that the sporting population will always have the ability of, unless they've been exposed to it at a young age, kind of like where they've kept those ranges of motion and those kind of positions you want to be in. So then it kind of switched for me to how much time do I want to spend teaching them so that they look and move incredibly well and are technically proficient. But if I only have 3 years with them and they're only with us during the academic terms, which is about 6 to 8 months, with holidays in between, maybe I need to look at the derivatives where they can pick those things up, still learn the principles, still learn kind of like what we're going after, but maybe I need to look at things like a clean pull or a trap bar power pull, or maybe they can't. I've got a few kind of like rock climbers, they can't really get into front rack position because of where their shoulders are, but they can snatch. So maybe we look at speed strength work through the snatch, and we look at a clean pull or trap bar pull for speed for strength speed work, kind of like at that other end of the force kind of force curve, force velocity curve. So we kind of started to play around with it in that sense. Yeah, and then for myself, really, I've just tried to stay as wouldn't say I'm amazing, but as technically proficient as possible for my ability. And as sure as you find, I think it's you either use it or you lose it. So I just keep the lifts going these days so that I can still perform them when I need to, and in my terms, perform them with some kind of load, for my own satisfaction, but also for whenever I need to demonstrate them or coach them.
Yeah, well, you did mention also that for the time you have your athletes, if it's only for a short while, it makes probably better sense to just train the derivations, the derivative lifts, the accessory lifts as well, the
Yeah,
components of the clean and jerk and the snatch, because I believe that there's many trainers, many coaches out there that are eager to teach the clean and jerk and the snatch, but because it is such a complex movement, I don't believe they're doing themselves or their athletes a good service of really encouraging the whole complex movement. But instead, I mean, it takes time to
yeah,
develop the sequencing, the proper mechanics, the proper rack position, as you say. So it's good to hear others going, yeah, I break it down and we'll just work on the high pull or work on the full pull,
yeah.
the first pull, or we're just going to work on, can we get triple extension? Maybe with a medicine ball, forget the barbell and
Yeah, yeah,
so on.
absolutely, absolutely. And I think for me, everyone favors particular complexes to teach people how to,
Sure.
and I think for me, what I've learned being around different practitioners earlier on in my career is one would have, this is the way I'm doing it, this is the kind of this is my clean complex, this is how they learn the clean, this is how they learn the snatch. And then I move to my next job and it's like, this is how we learn it here. And then I'm like, well, it's not the one's right or wrong. And then they go to another place and it's like, well, this is how it's done here, or the UKCA, they have their way. I do some tutoring for British weightlifting. They have their model. That's the governing body for weightlifting in our country. And it's not the one's right or wrong, but it's just different takes because it's such a technical kind of movement pattern, that I just started to think, okay, what's the simplest way that I feel if I'm coming in and learning these things or trying to learn these skills, that I would pick these things up. It wouldn't dominate the 60 to 90-minute session that I'm receiving in S&C. It is a key important part, but we can still chase the adaptation and the stimulus that we're wanting from that session, rather than we spent an hour and a half working on that one thing with the bar, but they've not actually got all, with Tekker's plates. I'm not knocking those things. And if it's a weightlifting class, brilliant, or a weightlifting club, then it makes perfect sense. But I guess I started to think, so I did a little bit, it's very, very low level, but a little bit of competitive masters level, kind of like Olympic weightlifting. And that's when I started to realize that unless actually you're planning to compete in Olympic weightlifting, whether that's at a club level or, whatever, does it really matter if you have, obviously there are key components we want, but does it really matter if it's so technically proficient that a ref will kind of white light it or red light it? It probably doesn't. So yeah, I was with a skeleton bobsleigh athlete today. Like, we do hang snatch, catching in power, so hang power snatch, hang power cleans. We don't catch in the bottom of front squat. We don't catch in the bottom of overhead squat. But it creates the adaptation that they need, that sees them jumping really well, and moving decent load. There's still key components as we get to their kind of like top end of percentage loading that keep it kind of coaching cues that we need to work on, where things, kind of habits creep in. And but that's the same as if we're rep maxing on a back squat or something. As the form can start to break down, and obviously the body will recruit different areas to try and complete that lift. So there's still that element of coaching that's required. We're just not worrying about the fact that it wasn't from the floor, kind of like, in the way that it might be done in an Olympic lifting competition, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes complete sense. So within the University of Manchester, your role as the lead strength conditioning coach there, which sports do you oversee? If you say all of them, can you give me an understanding of what sports are on campus for their student
Yeah, of
athletes?
course. Yeah, absolutely. So our performance teams, we're a different setup here to how the colleges might run in the States. Our performance teams consist of netball, football. We have rugby from time to time, and we've had basketball in the past. So they're the teams that we would support. The way we tend to do that here is less about one coach leading that, as in being the sole deliverer. So the way I tend to try and have the team deliver is, it's a service rather than these are my teams and my athletes, and the other coach or the other coaches don't touch them. They have their athletes, their coaches, because that for me creates a bit more of a. I'm not knocking anyone else and how they do it, but for me, I wanted to create a holistic service, where, be it a team, if I'm off on annual leave or sick, and another coach steps in to run my session, they have enough rapport with them that the service continues to deliver to a high standard, because it's about the institute supporting the athletes rather than it being about me. It's about what the institute that I represent kind of like can support. And then we are multi-sport. So to list some of the sports that we currently support, so we have skeleton bobsleigh. We have start with winter sports first of all. Free ski, which is where you do the jumps and things. We have para ski as well. We have what else do we have? We have badminton. We have rock climbing. We have fencing. We have rugby. We have athletics, so discus, long jump, triple jump in there. We have swimming. And there'll be quite a few others that I'm missing there. Yeah, we have boxing, sorry, and yeah. So basically we pretty much can cover any sport depending on what the scholars require. Basically, so some para sports. They also, para ski, wheelchair basketball, boccia, which is kind of like a bowls type sport. So it can really vary the sports and the athletes each year that come in. So our ability to program for them, to support them, and to provide them with the strength and conditioning that's appropriate for them at their training age and their training level, kind of like takes a bit of skill, and that's not just from me, that's from my team as well. With those athletes, because they're coached individually, what we tend to do, I tend to, again, it's still a service, so they could get coached by me or by the assistant strength and conditioning coach, Jacob, but one of us will take the lead on the programming for particular athletes, so for particular sports. So Jacob tends to do the fencing, I tend to do the skeleton bobsleigh stuff. But there are other sports where, he does a bit of the athletic stuff. I've done the boxing, but those athletes will get coached by either of us depending on when they go in for their S&C, if that makes sense.
Oh, that's exciting. That's truly exciting. You've got so many different physical demands with the sports that you've listed that I'm curious when it comes to resistance training with these athletes. Do you pretty much cover the fundamentals strictly as the core, or do you branch away from the fundamental or foundational lifts to be a little bit more specified to their movement demands? For
Yeah,
instance, bobsled skeleton, we're probably looking at explosive lower body and
yeah.
speed and power. So are you going to have them do a whole bunch of sled pushing, sprints, and thus, or are you going to say, okay, we still need to do the squats, the lunges, the deadlifts, the push, the pull, the hinge, and so on? How does that
Yeah.
work?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So I think I'll probably answer it with we're looking at two sports if that helps. So
Please.
two ones. So skeleton bobsleigh I'm happy to answer, but also boxing because they're two that I'm currently working with. So firstly for me, it's understanding for those athletes where they're at within the current pathway of their sport. So it's linking in with the S&C coaches within the national governing body and what they're
Mm,
looking for well, basically, what are the metrics that they measure that show improvements in athletic performance? Once I've understood what those metrics are in that governing body, then I'm able to program and design the programs based on that. So in that sense, for those types of athletes, if their training age is incredibly low, we're still going to look at the kind of developing optimal movement patterns and those types of things. But if the training age is a bit higher, as a boxer and a skeleton athlete that I'm currently working with, what I did, so the skeleton athlete, for example, or skeleton, they look at within their a 15-meter sprint, they look at a ISO squat push kind of overcoming ISO squat push on force plates. They look at counter movement jump and they look at a drop jump RSI. So those were the metrics. So if those are the metrics, then we're going to chase for me, what are the quickest ways to get the adaptation that show improvements in those metrics, because they're the things that in this country they pride themselves on creating the fastest pushes, which is basically the sprint from the start, pushing the sled before you get onto the sled. So that time frame, that's what British skeleton bobsleigh prides itself in creating, is the fastest sprinters and starters. Within GB boxing, again, I linked in with the coaches there. One of their coaches used to be a member of my staff at my previous place and has gone on to much bigger and better things, and is now kind of running the pathway GB boxing stuff. So for them, although the strength and power is important, it's actually because it's amateur boxing around the aerobic development. So it was understanding their testing metrics around that. This coach is called Sam, and what he's looking for when he develops the aerobic capacity tests and kind of like the numbers he's looking for. So although they still have in there a drop jump and a counter movement jump, and I think they do an IMTP as their strength test. Those metrics aren't as high for them as the aerobic kind of numbers that their kind of boxes put out. That's the kind of like, so there's a different focus. So it might be a higher
hmm
aerobic focus for the boxing, where there's a higher power strength focus for the skeleton, because they're two different sports, two different demands. And that really has shaped my mentality within like, right, so now I understand that. Now I need to understand the athlete and what's going to get the best adaptation out of them. So understanding how they're wired, how they think, building that rapport with them, but also understanding what's the quickest way to get that adaptation. So with the skeleton bobsleigh athlete, for example, if they're going to be tested within an ISO squat push, well, we're probably going to, and then the positions they get in at the start of their of when they're pushing on the track, when they're sprinting, we don't really need to worry about being in the bottom of a squat, kind of like full depth. It's not to say that they shouldn't have that range or that ability at different points in the season, but as they're kind of peaking towards the start of season, probably actually what we need to look at is partial ranges, so pin squats, high box squats, um, things like that, overcoming ISOs into some sort of explosive jump movement so we've got that kind of like high neural drive. We don't really want to be chasing because they get weighed and they need to be under a certain weight class, so we don't really want to be chasing any kind of muscle mass or kind of hypertrophic adaptation. So we need that neural adaptation, but without the gaining of muscle mass. Similar with the boxers, they've got to make weight, so we need them to be able to punch hard. We need them to be robust enough to hold their posture and to be able to. They tend to box at amateur level for 3 rounds or so, but it could be obviously the intensity of those fights can vary within each round. So that engine becomes a bigger priority. So I need to make sure that they're doing the aerobic work, kind of that will meet that demand. Yeah, so kind of like that's how I've tended to pitch it basically, and then looked at within the boxing, because RSI is a really important kind of like quality for them. Then I've looked at ankle stiffness for this particular boxer, their reactive strength. How do we develop that? What does that look like for them, as well as building that engine? So that's kind of how I've tended to form the programming. So with the skeleton bobsleigh athlete, we do Olympic lifts or derivatives of them. Um, with the boxer, I haven't really touched any of those things because they're into competition and have been in since they've been working with me. So that's the other thing for me, is like how much time they're already competing. I haven't got time. I haven't got the time and the luxury of like we're going to spend a good 6 months working on these things and slowly building it up. They're competing now, so I need to make sure that they're getting as much adaptation as possible in the time frames that I have between fights, and kind of like making sure that they taper at the right times, in line with their boxing or in line with competing on the ice and things.
Certainly, load management, definitely. And it'll fluctuate throughout the season, of course, and with their competitions. So that's all very captivating because you're you're at one hand taking traditional approaches and tweaking them just enough to grant them the stimuli that they are needing at this moment in time. But then there comes a time where your creative processes, I imagine, go even further to developing movements based on the needs analysis that may not mimic or be a traditional lift entirely. And what I mean by that is, like you mentioned, reactive training and reactive strength. So there may be like machines like the Proteus or something like that that we can, if you have the resources to use those type of movements. But I imagine you develop, uh, for lack of a better word, exercises. You develop positions or movements based on what they need. So with that, what are some of the more curious creations that you have put into a person's program with the expectation that this will create either more endurance, more aerobic capacity, or greater upper body power, or whatever it is you're seeking?
Yeah.
Do you know what I'm saying? Like,
Yeah,
what
yeah. No,
creative?
it's a great question. Yeah, I completely
Yeah,
understand. So I think I'll probably answer it again in two ways using these two sports. So if I take the skeleton bobsleigh athlete as an example, first of all, so they when last year, this time last year, their kind of metrics on the overcoming ISO squat was that they were putting out 6.2 times body weight on that squat, which is a decent number, very, very decent
yeah.
number. So this is a female skeleton bobsleigh athlete. By May, we had that at 6.7 times body weight. So I wasn't 100% sure whether we were going to get much more juice squeezed out of that for me. I kind of like, but there wasn't a huge need because it's obviously a sprint-based sport and we were on the track a lot as well. There wasn't a huge need to chase much more strength. So that wasn't as a priority as we moved through the summer because obviously it's a winter sport. But we still needed to maintain a degree of strength through the kind of like through the off season, even though we were transitioning more into we were like on the track 3 times a week and in the gym twice a week. Because it's a winter sport, they in the summer they just train either track or gym. They don't have anything else on because obviously there's no snow, there's no ice, as it were. And we're in a country here where, although down south where the NGB is based, they have a push track. We don't have any ice, and we're not a country that's blessed with snow very often. So, kind of like whilst we were going, kind of continuing this route and maintaining that strength, one of the things that I played around with, and it's one of the benefits I think of being at the higher education level of strength and conditioning, is that you can kind of try things out, and if it doesn't work, well, you've not lost anything, but potentially if it does work, you've potentially discovered something. It might be anecdotally, but you've discovered something. So I used kind of like a big advocate of using blood flow restriction training for hypertrophy, for tendon health, for injuries and rehab. But I started to, there's a guy in Australia who I link in with occasionally, Chris Gavalio, and he has used it a lot within driving neural adaptation for kind of strength adaptations, basically. So I got to thinking, well, if I know that an overcoming ISO of some form, be that in a lunge position or a squat position or a IMTP, drives neural adaptation, and there's research emerging that putting the cuffs on someone while they do something at kind of like not maximal load, but higher load, so 70-80% of load, and possibly even in isometric contraction can drive neural recruitment. I kind of put two and two together and thought, well, let's see if we get four from it, or if I'm way off and I get I get my sums wrong. And what we saw from May last year to June, simply by doing the same exercises, which was basically a box squat, high box squat, once a week, and a ISO lunge, overcoming ISO lunge of like 3 seconds each side, and these were the same exercises we were using earlier in the year where we saw the changes. So we hadn't added in new exercises, if that makes sense. Was that we saw this athletes, and we weren't going for this. We were just trying to maintain strength. We saw her kind of output jump from a 6.7 times body weight to a 7.42 times body weight. So it absolutely shot up in just over a month, about 6 weeks. You're talking somewhere in the region of 500-600 newtons, that's kind of like been added there. And all we've done is included the cuffs in an intermittent cuff pressure. So that was quite interesting for me in an anecdotal way of like, maybe there's some things to explore here. When I feel like I've squeezed, is there any more juice to squeeze out of something and I need to get a little bit more out of them, or I want to continue to maintain strength but without that constant high pressure of heavy bar loads and the potential joint issues that people have if the joints feel sore after, obviously when they're at that 90-95% max load constantly, that type of thing. So that was quite interesting from that front to learn that kind of anecdotally, and it's something I still use now when I feel it's needed. They usually have a higher training age before I implement that, so I wouldn't put the cuffs on someone with a month's training age and then get them to do because we're going to get a neural adaptation just for them learning the movement patterns with a bit of load. With the boxer, for example, they need their RSI, their ankle stiffness, to be better. So we're then looking at a use of combination of things. So your rudimental plyometrics, so your pogos, getting kind of like establishing that ankle stiffness, making them aware of that, and kind of using things like simple things like calf strength, so seated calves exercises, or kind of like Smith machine standing calf exercises, be that kind of like normal reps, sets and reps of where they're building kind of like where you've got normal contraction taking place in the muscle, or be that in an isometric form, kind of holding in those different positions. So I'm quite a fan of them doing heavy ISOs on the Smith machine, kind of like on one foot on the toe, kind of in that plantar flexion position, kind of having to really contract and hold and work hard to hold that position, but then do the same on the seated calf machine, where their foot's in dorsiflexion, not beyond dorsiflexion, but where they're working really hard to hold that ankle stiffness in that position, alongside including some of the more traditional calf raise kind of exercises that you would have. What I tended to find was that started to build that ankle stiffness for them, kind of and that ability, along with the rudimental pliers, because you want them to be able to anticipate the ground, absorb the force, react and reapply it, and push down into the ground to explode. And then we started to introduce, drop jumping from lower boxes, kind of like building that up to the appropriate level for them, so that they weren't on the ground for too long, measuring that. So make it kind of like, I usually use about kind of like 0.25 as my kind of like ground contact time. If they're going above that, then probably they're spending a bit too much time on the ground. I just use that, it's not gospel, I just use that as a bit of a marker as to what box to kind of like height to have them reacting from. But what I found in the past is if I went straight to a drop jump, they did and include some rudimental plows. I felt there was a gap, and that kind of like ankle work around stability, strength, and being able to hold, tolerate high pressures within load in at the top of range at the kind of like in plantar flexion at the in range within dorsiflexion was probably the thing that was missing for me, and that's allowed me to start to kind of develop that ankle stiffness with that boxer.
Right on. So just curious, the duration of an ISO hold, are we talking 10 seconds, 30 seconds, a minute?
Sure.
How long? Just to fatigue or
Yeah.
what?
So with the overcomings, if it's bilateral, I go 5 seconds. If it's unilateral, I go 3 seconds each side. If it's earlier in the season, sorry, earlier in the off season. So, for example, we're in the off season with skeleton at the moment. We might do 3 seconds each side twice. So that's a total of 6 seconds, obviously. But like they'll switch between each leg. Um, for anything like the calf work that I'm talking about, if we're going for tissue capacity, we're looking at 20 to 30 seconds. If we're going for the ankle stiffness stuff, I tend not to go more than 10 seconds, but
Mhm.
do it twice. So, as in like 10 seconds per rep, 2 reps, 3 reps, usually not three, but like kind of where they're working hard for that 10 seconds. So they're just beyond that kind of maximal overcoming element, but they've not fully dipped into kind of traditional yielding isometric times, is where we tend to sit. If they lack the tissue capacity and the ankle stiffness, we might sit at like a 15-second hold and do that 2 rounds. So they accumulate to 30 seconds within that set. But we've still got some decent, because if I put the load on that they can cope with for 30 seconds, let's say in a single leg seated calf hold, it's going to be significantly less compared to 15 seconds. So it allows me to get more load into that joint. But so it depends on what the tissue capacity, what the goal is, whether it's tissue capacity or joint stiffness. In like our footballers, so our soccer players, as you guys would call them, like that's more about tissue capacity. So then we're looking at a 30-second within a calf hold, that type of thing, because we're less worried about the ankle stiffness, although they still need it for sprinting. We're more concerned about tissue capacity because of the length of their game, being 90 minutes, the issues we see around the calf that can creep up, that type of thing.
And do you vary the joint angle or range of motion? So are you at terminal, mid-range, where, or do you just have it first set, we're going to be mid-range, then you're going to
Yeah.
increase the joint angle and so on?
Yeah, no, we do vary it. So I tend to find that at the top end range this is anecdotally, but of the plantar flexion, so of a full calf raise, be it myself or any other athlete, you might find the same in your own training. I don't have the strength at that top end range that I might have through the mid range. There is a place where we need that strength at that top end bit, but if the sport, they're not really getting into that, so boxers don't really get into that kind of full triple extension of the back foot in the same way as like a sprinter might, for example. Then I'm probably going to look more at mid-range to kind of like the start of the range for them, because of where they are, and although they're on their toes, they're not high on their toes when they're boxing. Yeah, whereas with a skeleton or sprinter, for example, so a sprint-based sport, be that skeleton bobsleigh or kind of like our triple jumpers or whatever, like then kind of like we need the ankle stiffness for definite, but we also need that strength at that top range because of how hard they're pushing into the floor to basically generate the force to propel them, be that horizontally or vertically.
I love it. I love it. And this is no surprise. You've taught me quite a bit. And just with your experience and your knowledge, I knew this was going to be a fun conversation. And I have not been leaning toward isometrics as much as I potentially could. So it's refreshing to hear that you're getting such great gains and benefits from implementing such things. So I really appreciate you sharing that. This, just from a personal perspective, are you, without getting you in any trouble or anything, are you
No,
happy
that's
at the
fine.
University of Manchester? Do you have
Yeah.
loftier pursuits? Do you have a career path that you're targeting, or I'll do the 5-year question. Where will Nathan Norris be in 5 years from now?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question because it's probably something I'm currently asking myself. When I started out in this career, I was in professional rugby league, but I was around university settings because that's where the training took place, and that was it. So I've been coaching for where are we for about 13, 14 years now, and I identified at that time that I wanted to basically run an S&C program at a university. So, it took me a lot of years of hard work to get to where I am now, and I've been doing it for the last 3 years. So, yeah, it probably took me about 10 years of work, identifying where I felt the gaps were, being supported by mentors and the coaches I've learned from in the past. So the last 3 years, that's probably the question I've been asking myself. I thoroughly enjoy this age range. So I really enjoy the young adult age range. I think that as a coach, working with youth or young adult athletes is a real privilege because you get to be you get to be a coach, potentially a bit of a big brother to them. You get to basically you watching them grow up, which is an absolute privilege. Watching them grow in independence, grow in confidence. You get to have banter with them. You get to have a laugh with them. They're motivated, they're driven, but also they're keen to learn, not just about strength and conditioning, but about life. And in that sense, I consider it a real privilege that I get to be, for whatever it applies to for them, a bit of a role model. I don't walk into coaching sessions thinking I'm a role model, just more through hopefully modeling what a good coach should be, that empowers, that builds up, that equips, that educates, and that basically gives them a good experience of athletic development rather than just screams at them and makes them feel pretty crappy about themselves. So to answer your question, I'm not 100% sure. I'm quite interested to explore the scene in America within the collegiate setting. I've talked with my boss in the past about whether there's any partnerships that our university might have with American universities, and be that summer programs or that type of thing. Or it might be that as the opportunities of our university grow, that things branch up into other areas. At the moment, I'm kind of just keeping my options open and enjoying the challenge, because every year we get a batch of athletes through that are new with new challenges. That's kind of like what I'm sinking my teeth into at the moment. But in 5 years' time, I'd certainly hope to certainly hope that I'd have more, probably maybe a bit of a private sector practice on the side, a bit of a side hustle of that, as well as doing a little bit more contractor work with some of the governing bodies that we have in the region and in the country to support their athletes at different points in times.
Well, I have a feeling that all of those things will be coming true, because you
Oh,
have
thank you, Raj.
quite a passionate path ahead of you, and it emanates from your words and from your body language and everything else. And it's been a privilege having this conversation with you. I can't thank you enough again for putting a little time aside for just sharing your experience and your knowledge. So I'm forever grateful. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
And there goes another episode in the books. Man, what a great conversation. I can't thank Nathan enough for coming on and being late at night when we recorded this. He's a trooper. Remember, the NSCA's National Conference is happening this summer, July 16th to the 19th, Kansas City, home of the barbecue. But you can also go to Long Beach, Chicago, or Providence, Rhode Island for 3 days of incredible networking at Perform Better. And then, of course, for education, aside from those, you've got SatantaCollege.com. And, well, maybe my website too. We've got continuing education. If you like, stuff about biomechanics, structure, and training, maybe pick up my book, Return to Center, while you're at it. You guys are awesome. We'll see you next week.